Indian summer.
These questions around kind of power and privilege are going to be addressed quite a lot within the discussion, because I think the pandemic is, for a lot of us, especially for those of us who are working on issues around human rights and social justice, are constantly questioning our own power and privilege within the grand scheme of life anyway, but particularly now we're all questioning how is it that, you know, we can play a better role in our societies. So with that, I want to go to both of you and just ask you, what are the actual motivations behind your work and what compels you to make the work that you do? I'll just go in alphabetical order, so I'll go with Sajan first, if that's okay.
That's perfect. I think alphabetical order, we are both together. It starts S, no? Or the second letter, S-A. Yeah.
Exactly. No, there's no favoritism here.
Can you repeat the question once more?
Yeah, so what are your motivations behind your work, and what compels you to make the work that you do?
Okay, I will try to answer that question. I think it's multitude, it's different layers, and my experience with my body in different spaces that include public spaces, social spaces, member spaces, and so on. I mean, my work can be best described as post-colonial black-colored body in public space. Caste, which is a historical truth and everyday reality in India, is a subject matter of most of my works. But I'm also working with the different other subjects, forced migration of plants and seeds. And my parents were rubber tappers, so I'm very much interested in the history of rubber and using rubber a lot in my medium. What inspires my work is my own life. Life in the sense, like, whenever I was trying to travel or cross boundaries of different public spaces, especially in India, was my primary inspiration or behind my work. And because there was a lot of like experience I had with my black colored body when I'm carrying this body in different public spaces in India. So there was a lot of blockage, there was a lot of resistance, there was a lot of issues, there was a lot of problems. So, and I mean, initially I was thinking, what is it? I mean, like, I'm critically looking back and what is it? Like, and then maybe that's maybe the reason behind I became a performance artist initially. Because after some years, I realized I'm doing a performance since my birth. I mean, the social reality of the spaces which I was living was my inspiration. And mainly body, space, and time are my materials fundamentally. And currently I'm experimenting with moving images and installations. I'm also interested in what is not art or the boundaries of the so-called art and everyday life. I'm always interested in history and alternative ways of archiving because dead bodies don't have a history of archiving in India. Maybe does that answer you somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting for our audience to understand a little bit more about how performance actually works, and that's something I want to talk a bit about later, the difference between how different art forms actually work. particularly in the Western, climate, performance is really a kind of reserved of the privileged, and to see how different artists are actually accessing performance, particularly somebody like yourself, and where the black body is so fetishized. And it's interesting to see how you're actually using your own body within these spaces to have these discussions. You can hear me okay, Sajan?
Yeah. But okay. I didn't get the question.
There wasn't a question. It's fine. I was just saying it's interesting in the Western context for our readers particularly, because a lot of them aren't necessarily our own audiences to understand how performance actually works and what kind of influence it has on the audiences that you are showing your work to.
To be honest, the sound is really, but yeah, I hope you were asking me in the Western context, Western climate, how my performance were receiving, or in the context of other performance, Western performance artists, or the genre of performance art in the Western context.
I mean, I guess there is an observation there in terms of how yourself, as an artist living in Berlin, how are audiences actually receiving your work? The experience, how are people accessing that work? How are people receiving the messages that you're communicating to them?
Okay. Got it. I mean, it's really difficult, but also, as we all know, and also as Ambedkar wrote about the caste, when Indians moving in different spaces in the globe, caste is also moving with them. So caste is not just a South Asian reality; it's an international reality, whether in diasporas in UK or whether in diasporas in Desi diasporas in US. You can look to different Hindu foundations there and so on. So caste is an international phenomena, but it's still very, like, I mean, we are part of that problem, and we are part of that hiding this discussions. I mean, as Indians, the so-called colonial country called Indians, we are very famous for hiding things and refusing. So, but anyway, also Western, like this binary understanding of the world, and very difficult to understand the complexities of India, the so-called India. So that's also limiting Western or white world audience to understand what is caste and what is the realities of South Asia and the complexities of India and so on. So it's still like the other, I think Rajasri Gudi once mentioned in her one of the conversations, like a lot of the time it becomes like an education program than, you have to educate people, kind of like than the position of the artist. Like it's a challenge, but yeah, let's see.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you both to mute when you're not speaking. I think that might overcome some of the technical issues. Okay, so moving to Sohrab now, the same question. What are your motivations behind your work, and what compels you to make the work that you do? And again, if you could give us a little bit of an introduction to some of your work, particularly the work that you've done on the MNR EPA Act and in Kashmir as well.
For me, like when I was listening to Sajan, I could connect to a lot that he was talking about, because for me also, I think photography began more from a place of therapy, because my mum was not well, and that was the way for me to kind of deal with, her illness. And a lot of my work, I mean, I'm not sure if I can describe myself as a social justice photographer as such, because I think I look at uh, the element of autobiography is quite important to the way I deal with even the outside world, because, you know, in the beginning, I used photography to look at my own life, but at the same time, I finished my master's in economics in Delhi, and it just so happened that I found myself on this journey, you know, across 10 states in India, part of the Right to Food campaign in 2005, because my professor in university was the architect of that, you know, act, Jean Reyes. So I'd been asked to actually come along with the people who are going into just take photographs for them to kind of give it for all the press releases, you know, in all the little towns and villages, wherever we stopped, you know, to the local journalists, because the local dissemination of what was happening was really important for the movement at that time. And I was also there to kind of volunteer, you know, by holding up the banners and, you know, washing up the dishes and so on. So for me, honestly, it was, it sounds really corny, but it was really a life-changing experience, because what happens in this urban class, upper caste household is that very often rural India gets looked at in a very romanticized way. So for me, it was quite a reality check, because half the times we keep hearing about, you know, thandi hawa under, you know, under the tree and so on and so forth, and it's sort of this idyllic setting that is always proposed to us, maybe by my own family, you know, grandparents who might have lived a certain kind of privileged rural life at some point. But for me, it was a sort of a reality check, you know, that journey. And also it was this one journey where uh, I actually got to understand what solidarity meant, you know, because for the first time, 230 organizations had come together and they were working under one sort of an umbrella movement. You had students, you had academics, you had, you know, a lot of sangatans, not NGOs, because NGOs are quite, people are quite skeptical in the grassroots, you know, about NGOs because of where the funding comes from and so on. So sangatans are more like unions, and you know, you'll have like villages getting together and forming their own sangatans because they don't have, for example, there's a famine in some areas. So how do you deal with that? How do you hold the government accountable? You know, so I got to see all these tools that were being taken. And at that time, I was also someone who had studied, done my master's in economics. So obviously, there's always this chip on your shoulder. You know, Delhi School of Economics, where Manmohan Singh used to teach, where Amartya Sen used to teach. So there is a sort of an arrogance in it as well. And then you kind of realize how you have to kind of unlearn a lot of things once you see people who you apparently, or sort of systems that you apparently study in class, which you actually see them working in a way which is quite different from what you're taught, you know. So I think this idea of systems is really important to me, because my work is actually more about looking at systems, even when I'm looking at my own self. So, you know, when you're talking about the work which is to do with the Narega, which became Manrega later, and I think in India we are always more interested in renaming things than actually implementing things properly. So I don't know what it might be called now, or you know, in the near future. But the thing is, it was an act. It wasn't a food for works program, which used to be, you know, implemented earlier whenever there would be a famine, which was more like a dole being given to people. So the one thing that was really important was also the right to earn and dignity, the right to employment. You know, this element of dignity was really important in the proposition that was put forward to the government at that time. So a lot of my work in the beginning began from that, in a strange sort of a way, a bubble of a space, which I realized later on, because you know, I would go and make these images, get these stories, and then where do you put these images out? You know, you didn't have the internet the way it existed at that time, and but once you came back to Delhi, you realized, like in my case, you realized that not many were interested in putting these works out. And we also had, the armchair activists, and sometimes I feel like one of them, who had their own opinion on what, like this whole element of why should the taxpayers' money go here, and like we always bring this idea of why should the taxpayers' money go here, and today it's kind of amplified into different directions. And most of us who actually say this don't pay taxes ourselves. Our tax collections are really low. And at the same time, the truth is that everyone pays taxes, because when you buy something, you're paying an indirect tax, but that's never, it's always used as a weapon, So I realized that this whole thing of a certain position, which was being countered by the urban middle class, there were certain sort of phenomena that were being weaponized and sort of put forward, and today I can actually trace it back to, back in 2005 and even further back there. But that was the first time I started to realize these confrontations and these so-called, different sort of arguments that were coming up, and what was being we would always talk about a free market economy, but nobody would explain what a free market economy really was, but that would just be sort of put forward. I think I had my own sort of existential crisis with what I was doing, because it wasn't just about making the work, it was about putting it out there. Because I think, like I always maintain that the meaning of the work is not so much in making it, but more in how you put it out. And the meaning of the work repeatedly keeps changing over and over again. And I mean, a lot of my works are always looking at my own position, because I realized that that was the way for me to kind of back my work, to take responsibility for it, and to also kind of, I do realize it's a gray world where there are definite positions, like there are certain things which I absolutely consider to be wrong. But at the same time, I also am interested in navigating the grayness of things, because I feel like today we're not really listening to each other much. We are mostly sort of talking in terms of universal truths. So even the work that you referred to later on to, Snow, which is the work that I did in Kashmir, I went to Kashmir for the first time as a tourist, and I went to Gulmarg, thinking that Gulmarg was the equivalent of Kashmir. And anyone who goes to Kashmir, I mean, I'm speaking in terms of anecdotes, but anybody who goes to Kashmir comes back with an overwhelming experience of generosity and love. I think I had that same experience of having gone there and having sort of had these profound moments where you feel so touched by how warm people are towards you, because I was very conscious of going there, knowing, all the human rights violations that had happened. And I kind of knew of, I'd heard of all these different sort of positions that made really sense to me. But there I found myself in Kashmir and Gulmarg there waiting for snow, enjoying snowfall, And it was only while I was leaving that even the army presence at every 200 meters, I knew that it was the most militarized zone in the world and so on. And I somehow, it was only on the way back that I felt really suffocated by all of it, So the moment I think I had this emotional experience, which anyone who goes there has, and most people who go there kind of come back with a sort of a disillusionment of what, they had been fed all this while, and or what they had thought, it was all about, Kashmir. And I kind of felt like I also had a stake, but not really a stake to say something, but more like a stake to listen, because I think there's a lot of noise around Kashmir in India, and everyone has an opinion on it. And I think it's also the biggest failure of the liberals in India, who kind of will kind of condemn all the human rights violations, but at the same time, they totally ignore what the Kashmiris have to say, which is about, autonomy. So for me, the work Snow is more about my own denial as an Indian, as an outsider, because whenever I went there, whenever I've been going back there, the issue of identity kind of is always coming up in the most gentle ways, where people always say that, I'm Kashmiri, you're Indian, I'm so happy you're here. We don't want the government here, but we want you here. But, there's a separation of an identity. And you can't help it. I mean, I'll be in denial if I'm to ignore that part, and just condemn whatever the army is doing and, whatever the government's doing. Because I think all of these elements are coming from my denial as, as a liberal or as an Indian national, and as someone who's kind of threatened by the separation of identity. So yeah. I hope that makes sense. And
no, it does completely. So I'm really happy that you mentioned some of those things, because this position that you're talking about of being this outsider kind of reminds me of the time that I was introduced to your work, Sohrab, because if you remember, it was back in 2005 where I'd been to India after a very, very long time, and I was making work on India. And at that time, obviously, if you don't know much about photography, most of the images that you see in India are from Steve McCurry, and it's very National Geographic-esque. And I obviously came across your work, Sohrab, and that for me was a really nuanced kind of introduction to the issues that I cared about, and especially when we think about public policy and this romanticism that, diaspora communities have for India. It is often this romantic kind of rose-tinted view that we have of India. And so when the government is criticized for not doing enough, often what we hear is a narrative around, well, we've only been independent for 60 years and it's still going to take time, etc., etc. And I think, your work on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, for me, really kind of highlights the kind of failures of the government. And, yes, there are these policies in place, but what do those realities actually look like on the ground for the people that are promised these opportunities for social mobility? So as somebody who is perhaps kind of almost comparably in the position that you're in Kashmir, as an outsider looking in, it is one of liberalism. And how do we confront our own complicity within that equation to highlight some of those complexities and those human rights violations that are so clear when you're close to the subject matter? So maybe we can turn to Sajan in a second about that, but I'll just pose the next question now. So I feel that you're both concerned with issues relating to human rights and social justice, whether you agree with that or not. There may be some crossovers in your subject matter, but for the benefit of those who may not know much about art and cultural production, could you please explain the way in which your respective art forms operate or function in the world, particularly when it comes to how art may or may not contribute to advocacy, social or political change? Maybe you've kind of explained some of that, but maybe you could go into a bit more detail. So Sajan, maybe you can go first here. Are you on mute or are you okay? I think you might be on mute. I can't hear you at the moment, Sajan. There you go. Yeah, I can hear you now.
No, I was just commenting alphabetical order again. Okay. Sorry, could you please ask me again?
You can hear me okay, or just
yeah. Now okay. Yeah.
Okay, so can you please just explain how your art form of performance operates or functions in the world, particularly when it comes to how art may or may not contribute to advocacy, social or political change within the infrastructure of art, perhaps? What role does performance actually play?
Very complex question. I mean, first of all, I'm not an activist. And yeah, I'm an artist. And I think why I became an artist is to my failure to find the languages which I wanted to express. So art is allowing me to express my senses, feelings in different multitude of languages. I think art is fundamentally a collection of different languages, I think. I mean, not just limited to the language in that sense, but in the sense and sensorium in that sense. Yeah, I mean, of course, when I was starting my so-called practice, I haven't seen many artists in Indian contemporary art critically engage with the caste, which is a historical and contemporary reality of not only India but in South Asia. I mean, what we have been witnessing is like other writers and philosophers has mentioned already, is the Brahmanical modernity and its imaginations, whether from the Nandalal Bose to which school, Bombay school to this school to that school. Mostly this was happening, and we have been seen any critical reflection. In that sense, my tryouts of or trying to critically engage with the notions of Brahmanical knowledge production and also the ideas of Dalit consciousness and criticism towards this Brahmanical modernity, so on. So maybe it might help, or I don't know, Indian Brahmanical knowledge production is so strong. So I don't know how much we could, because it's appropriated many times itself, and so yeah, I mean, not only me, a lot of many young artists and image makers and activists and yeah, a lot of people working towards this to give a little bit of voice towards the voiceless. But as I started earlier, I don't know, like I don't consider myself as an activist or something, but as an artist, I think my responsibility is to critically engage with these things in our time. So that's what I'm doing, I think.
Okay, thank you.
That
And
makes sense?
Sohrab? Yes, it does. It does. I think there's this, especially over the last few years, while things have become more politicized, and a lot of artists are finding themselves in that position of having to, you know, really decide whether they're artists or activists. And I certainly have had that conflict myself as well. So as an artist, I guess it's about defining what your vision is and what it is that you're trying to do with your art, and knowing what the difference is between what art is supposed to do and what activism is.
Yeah, that border is really blurred. So yeah, that's also one. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
No, I mean, Sajan, what you say makes a lot of sense to me, especially because when you, like, I feel so conscious having seen activists on the ground that I feel very awkward in calling myself on, simply because I know that my motivations are not quite the same. And then I feel like, you know, I haven't earned my right to be called an activist in that sense. You know, so I'm happy to stick to an artist, photographer, whatever else, you know, because I'm happy with its flaws and to negotiate them. But also like, I'm very happy Sajan talked about language, because, you know, if I think about the system in which we exist today, I mean, first to go back to when you were talking about 2005, when you were introduced to my work and, you know, the failure of the government and so on. Today, it just feels like such an amazing time back then when one could even talk about these things, freely and hoping that the government would see it. Whereas today, people, a lot of voices are being kind of quietened. And so I think also what role does art have today also is changing with time, I think, in a way, going back to the element of language that Sajan was talking about, where it is true that, it's not just in art, but in society, the system is, it is a Brahmanical model. It's an upper caste model. It's an upper class model. It's a male model. It's an English speaking model. The very fact that we are talking here with you, like especially me, like talking in English and not someone else. These are opening of doors that the system kind of provides for a lot of people like me, for example. But what ends up happening is that it's also the same people. If you look at the critics, if you look at all the people who are trying to, in a way, talk about what language should exist. It's a very Brahmanical perspective. So for me, even if I look at what Sajan is doing and connecting it to what my own motivations is, given that, the ecosystem around me is becoming more and more difficult to navigate in terms of, talking about anything freely that actually questions anyone in power, which is also existing in so many different layers. It's not just the government, but it's like the whole system, so even I'm part of that hierarchy. But the thing is that today I feel my motivation and what I expect from art or what I'm doing is when I see a lot of revisionism happening in India and actually across the world, where even today I hear about this movement that is trying to say that the Holocaust never happened. Similarly, you have, we have, for example, the Hindu nationalists, RSS and all, they are trying to be the nationalists, so, and anybody who questions even things for the betterment of an idea of a nation becomes tagged anti-national. There is this new sort of system which is sort of trying to take over, and there is a sort of a new history being rewritten. So I feel like I'm not really looking to create change of any sorts. I think I gave up on that quite some time ago. But I'm looking more as a sort of a historian, where I'm trying to keep a record from my perspective. Like I'm here I'm not trying to take the position of a witness in a sort of a, in a moral way, but more moralistic way, but more in terms of, with my work, I want to kind of put it out there that I was here at this time, just like Sajan was talking about, existing today. We are all bearing witness. We're not necessarily playing activists, but we all bearing witness, especially when we all have something at stake today. More increasingly, it's getting more and more palpable. And I mean, for me, Sajan's voice is so important simply because the system tries to show such a different voice that exists. And I think that perspective shows that, the reality that I was exposed to is not quite a complete reality, And even if you look at, for example, the Ramayana, all these, textbooks, even that, there's so many versions of Ramayana that existed, but today what is filtered down to us, whether it's in terms of what is being criminalized and what's, being furthered more and more, is a sort of a Brahminical perspective where you will have this idea of purity and so on. And I love to kind of always bring up the movie Kala, because Kala is actually subversing, that sort of perspective. And it becomes another sort of a position which counters the larger populist mainstream narrative. So even, Paranjit, who made the film, who's also made the film Madras to do with, Dravidian Dalit politics, it's not it's not necessarily to create a change as such, where we, like how we recognize change, you know, in terms of social justice, but it's more to take a position which leads to a larger conversation that might hopefully bring about a change, you know. So I do see the balance of power constantly shifting. It's never really absolute, you know, and hopefully even all of us over here are going to overcome whatever this is, you know, the powers that exist in India today. But for that, you know, Sajan has to do what he's doing. I have to do what I'm doing. Other people have to do what they're doing in our small ways, you know. So that's what I think I expect from art, photography, literature, cinema, all of it. I think they're just different tools to kind of take, for people to take their own positions.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful what you've just summarized there, because it's about the power of storytelling and again, sort of this, maybe this romantic idea that we have as artists, you know, entering into whatever discipline we do, and however many years into this kind of journey, really sort of when it dawns upon us how what a mammoth task it is for this social and political change. And what you've just mentioned about archiving your work, whether it's you're archiving your performance, Sajan, or your photography, whatever, they become really evidence of something that existed. And it really brings me to the question of, you know, democracy and the democratization of art, and what is it that people are, what are the messages that people are actually receiving when they do access the work that we're making. And we often talk about India being the world's largest democracy. And as a person of Indian origin, I feel that this kind of statement can almost be worn as a badge of honor and pride. And as someone who works in the terrain of photojournalism, Sohrab, you know, I guess, you know, how does that make you feel kind of as a photographer making work about misrepresented communities? But also it's about the erosion of democracy, and this subject, this conversation around anti-nationalism and dissent. You know, art and academia are two places where we are supposed to be reserved for dissent and freedom of, you know, speech. So what does that mean if there is such a thing as a far right? Then if there must be something called a left. And art is supposed to be this area in which we are able to exercise dissent. And in terms of a movement, you know, where do you think we are as a transnational movement? Do we have this solidarity that we wish for? What does that look like for both of you? Maybe go to Sajan first and then Sohrab. You know, what does that look like?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I will read out one little bit from Kajal in this instance. Even so-called democratic intellectuals like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, Ranade, Gandhi, and Nehru were propped up by the British. Consciously or unconsciously, the British themselves helped to construct a Brahminical meritocracy that came to power in post-independence India. So I think it's pretty important. And the moment when Nathuram Vinayak Godse killed Gandhi, Indian right wing already won. So it's not the story of, it's not the recent reality of when Narendra Modi came to power, everything has changed. It's not. When we talk about Indian academia, actually Indian diaspora or Indian origin, from Gayatri Spivak to whatever extent, if you look into it, they're actually very powerful, like in academia, international academia. But it's very intriguing and very interesting to see that none of them was really talked much about caste or Indian Brahmanical knowledge production, and so on. They were talking about everything under the sun, and also this feeding, this post-colonial binary thing, which is very good for feeding white and a Western world. It was really good, and it's still continuing. So in that instance, yeah, I don't know, one more thing I will read. It's by Jean Dresse. The future of Indian democracy depends a great deal on the revival of Ambedkar's visionary conception of democracy. This vision, I believe, also needs to be enlarged and updated in the light of recent experience. This is from the radical Ambedkar, yeah. So I think these are my responses to that question. Or anything else you want to ask? Or?
Yeah, I was going to go to Sohrab, but I want to give you time to talk about your other project, which I think is a really, we're running out of time as well, so maybe this might be one of the last questions. But in terms of, you know, what we're doing as artists, I guess, is reflecting the culture around us. And, you know, maybe there's two questions here for you, Sajan. As a creative producer, how difficult is it to offer a counter narrative to what is being propagated by the extreme right? But in terms of culture, how do you think it is that culture is being transformed or influenced through the political leadership of somebody like Prime Minister Narendra Modi? And I guess I'm talking about your political yoga project, because for me, yoga has become this almost untouchable symbol of purity that comes to symbolize India. Much like Gandhi, it's something that you cannot criticize. It's a product that's been exported, which seems to be read as a force for good. And your political yoga project, I think, for me, highlights really well. If you haven't seen this piece by Sajan, please do take some time to engage with that piece of work, because for me it really highlights this kind of you know, double-sided coin that Narendra Modi has packaged himself as, you know, this kind of benevolent figure. It's almost like he's like this hologram. If you remember in the 2014 elections, there was this hologram image of Narendra Modi, and I think this is a very accurate depiction of him, where he is this benevolent figure to the public, but at the same time, there's this malevolence to, you know, the policies and the influence of those policies. So your political yoga project, you know, I'll pose that question again to you, Sohrab. How is it that you think culture is being transformed or influenced through the political leadership of somebody like Prime Minister Narendra Modi? And how do political leaders use their power to harness support behind a certain ideology? Or both of you, actually, maybe one by one. This might be the last question.
Oh, no. So, I mean, I don't know. In my mind, I was thinking of the earlier question, and if I can, you know, sort of mix it all up, simply because, you know, again, I agree with Sajan. In a way, like, for me to isolate Modi is not enough, simply because Modi is building upon a larger system. So when you're talking about democracy, you know, even when you go back to 1947, was it real democracy as such, where everyone had equal rights? You know, because when you're looking at this whole sort of system of power, you need to maintain some sort of a hierarchy to kind of have the system working. What has happened is that the Congress, for example, before Modi, the governments, they kind of did it behind a mask. They didn't do it overtly. So even when you look at Ayodhya, you know, you look at the Shah Bano case in 1985 with Rajiv Gandhi to kind of appease the Muslims. He kind of revoked the Supreme Court judgment that was going to, you know, give Shah Bano, you know, like give the judgment in her favor, where she would get, you know, alimony because of her separation or divorce. And then after that, when he saw that, the right-wing Hindus were getting riled up about it, to pacify them, he kind of announced that, Ayodhya would be Ram Rajya, the announcement of Ram Rajya. And he kind of got the locks of the Babri Masjid broken. So this is what Congress doing. But what Modi is doing is, or what this current government is doing, is the same thing, but a larger amplification and a much higher frequency. So also we're getting more and more aware. So we are realizing that it's all getting dangerous. So where the artist lies, I think we are always trying to feel the gaps and seeing what we can say, how we can get the message out there. And when you talk about democracy, again, going back to this larger system and looking at this, I'm sorry to kind of hover on to liberalism, because I think this is what has gotten us all into this mess. Because I think I actually thought so much about democracy. I had not thought this much about democracy as I had since December, when the CA and NRC were kind of put in place. And out there in the streets, you had students, especially students, and you had all these, women from Shaheen Bagh and other places who were actually at the forefront of this resistance. Now, as a photographer, I can go and document all of that. And yet, it's a bit weird that as a photographer, as an artist, suddenly then I'm trying to take on this identity of being an Indian artist, and I mean, I'm here at the moment. I don't know if it makes sense to you being in the UK, but at least over here, the question, who is an Indian artist, because again, who are the voices that represent Indian art, what is that brown body? Because there are many different shades of brown as well, but I ended up feeling, I mean, I'm going to give you a very awkward and weird answer simply because it was at this moment in the last few months that I started feeling even more and more how much of a convenience there was in also the artist or the photographer taking a position only within the arts, where that person is separating the arts from the real world out there, because we were all going out there and protesting against the CA, the NRC, which is, horrific. But at the same time, within our own sort of art space, we were going back to the same system of hierarchy in a very convenient way. So I'm not sure if I'm, addressing real politics in terms of political parties and all, because in a strong way, the real politics is actually existing on an individual basis in these smaller micro sort of systems. And it's also nice to hear Jean's, because Sajan, actually, Jean Drez, who you quoted, was my professor in university. And he's the one who took me with him. And he's the one who was talking about. Because, what he's talking about, we have to constantly look at the base, because when we are talking about the right and the left, like you were asking, there is a right and the left. The truth is, I feel there is a left, but it's a very tiny, tiny bubble, but it's mostly the right and a sort of a pseudo left of some sorts, because you also need some sort of posturing to take place to kind of, for the act of benevolence, for someone who considers himself to be liberal, like when in 2015, when you started to hear so much about, the lynching videos that were coming out, and it was always Dalit or Muslim lynching, and only right now, recently, you have the Palghar lynchings, which were the sadhus who were lynched, but it was also done by someone from the BJP cadre, which was never brought up. But the thing is that all these lynching videos that were coming up, you had a lot of apologists for those videos as well, for those acts, who would say, we don't support this, but we need development. So I think the problem lies more in these positions of you want to consider yourself liberal, you want to consider yourself the left, but is it really liberal or the left? Because we are all sort of party to it. And even the video that is showing the Loster and the Bird, when I'm bringing up, in the story that I'm narrating, when I'm bringing up the idiot photographer who's kind of coming in there to sort of also photograph the act of violence of the head being stolen, I also feel like I'm part of this larger system as much of an accomplice to the larger act of violence as the perpetrator, you know, whether it's me watching in silence, whether it's me, you know, condoning it in some way. If I am to talk about democracy, how can I not acknowledge Sajan's version of democracy, which might be very different from someone else's? But the fact is that very often Sajan and other people, their version of democracy is never really acknowledged, you know. So we want to kind of live in this sort of a status quo. And what is happening right now with the Modi government is that he's shifting the status quo, and that's all. But the status quo was always there, you know, from the time the constitution was drafted, where Ambedkar hoped for a, you know, a world that was a much better place. But I'm not sure it was a better place for everyone.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've said some really important things there, Sajan. I would like you to comment on that as well, please.
Yeah, I mean, like Sohrab saying, the complexity, for me, that's also very important. While we are talking about Indian art world, I'm really wondering what is really Indian art world, and who has the power, and who has the galleries, and who is doing what, and what is the knowledge productions and reflections going on there. This is also a crucial question. This is the, I mean, time has come to ask these questions, even though the so-called Indian art world is concentrated only on small, like urban cities or whatever. Yeah, I mean, also, when you mentioned about political yoga, I was just thinking yesterday when this political yoga was premiering on YouTube in Nottingham, Atmala, then my thinking to the partner, Anthony George Kutanadi, he was also wants to hear it live. And then suddenly YouTube was suggesting him Nityananda's new currency inauguration live. It was at the same time and YouTube was suggesting this. So yeah, also, I mean, India has this, the colonial construct, which is called India, the so-called India. What it was doing for quite, I mean, as a soft politics, is exporting the spirituality which is appropriated Brahminic spirituality. Then I'm not talking about the spirituality which is indigenous spiritualities and other spiritualities in India. And also very conveniently hide Buddhism and Buddhist spiritualities and so on. So it is really complex. And one more thing, sorry, I know that time is going out. When I was looking into the yoga, like from beer yoga to goat yoga to whatever extent yoga we know, in Indian Embassy's Facebook page in Berlin, I was looking into these images of Indian, like International Art Yoga Day celebrations. And very openly, Hindu right-wing minister is coming to the center of Alexanderplatz, which is the center of Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, openly doing this yoga positions, and white people and a little bit of brown people following these yoga positions. And Berlin as a city proclaimed this like, oh, we are very critically engaging everything and so on. So it was really like, in a way, it's like Nityananda's fun, but it's not just fun. For me, it's really a political act. Yeah, so yeah, I just shared these thoughts. I hope.
Yeah, I really appreciate. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that in a way, I was talking to Sajan that in a way it's like, for example, this Modi in yoga, it's a way of tapping into pop culture. It's a way of, you know, you kind of creating a sort of a cultural currency. And even in, for example, the art, so-called intellectual space, being on the left is also a sort of its own cultural currency. You know, to say that you are progressive, to say you are, you know, liberal, to say you are on the left, but actually the system is all geared towards the right. You know, including when you talk about, you know, literally like people who are vote banks for the right. So there's a conflict even within what you kind of project yourself as, because that's what you're supposed to do as a cultural producer or whatever, you know. And whereas as a person, you are you believe in something totally different, and that's what I think. For me was I kind of was listening to Sajan, and it was nice. It was almost like I was imagining myself lying in Shavasana, and Sajan was telling me some stories. And before I knew it, he started saying things that were very different, you know, which were about, he was provoking me, even in that relaxed moment. So what for me was really interesting was that just like, in a way, Narendra Modi has used the act of yoga as a sort of a tool to let people's guards down and to kind of put his message across, you know. Similarly, I saw Sajan kind of doing the same thing by, I remembered, you know, when I was a kid, when I had to do yoga at school, and I was listening to the yoga teacher telling a story, and Sajan began in his extremely relaxing voice, and I wanted to kind of fall asleep. And I started to flow with Sajan's voice. And before I knew it, he started to ask very sort of pertinent questions, which in other sort of, you know, circumstances, I might have been, I might have denied those questions, or I might have resisted them. So in a way, you know, for me, it was a very powerful way to kind of retake a sort of tool that is right now being, you know, used in a mass sort of a way to capture the masses. You know, it's a way to, even if it's not within India, it's outside India, you know, and it's just one of many different tools that has been used. Even if it's selfies with Bollywood celebrities, you know, or sending Twitter messages to cricketers and so on. I mean, in a way, he's a very sharp politician who knows exactly how to kind of use this very strong tool, powerful tool of narrative building. And for me, that's where power lies. You know, it's in how you create these narratives, and which is where, you know, who is the one who is giving space to these other voices. Like even the idea of representation. You know, you can, in a benevolent way, give a slot to someone, a Dalit artist, you know, an artist from a different part of India that's usually never really represented. But who is the person who's kind of committing this benevolent act? It'll always be someone who is in power. That's where the real power lies. And that's where I think these are the people who are kind of, and these are not necessarily these abstract entity of a government. I think it's also people like us, you know, in our daily lives, the acts that we are committing. So it's, you know, it's a far more intricate system than just being people versus the government. It's people within each other, you know, who are doing all of this.
I mean, absolutely. This is...
Sorry.
Go ahead, go, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this comments, and really feel humbled. One thing, only one thing I would like to add, Kajal, and then that's. I think, I mean, since it's a festival that hosting from UK, and maybe many Indian diaspora or Indian originated people will be watching possibly. So that's why specifically I'm telling this decoloniality and decolonial process is very active in academia and art in Western art spaces. But at the same time, we have to understand, we in Indian context, we also have to start a decolonial process, not just about the British colonial power, but the internal colonizer itself, like the 2,000-year-old story of that. Also, we have to start reflecting and talking about. Otherwise, we will be considered as a people who stagnated, or I don't know how will future will look to us. It's a very serious and very important juncture of history. Thank you.
You know, thank you so much for that comment. I think you're absolutely hit the nail on the head. And I wanted to keep it quite lighthearted, and I'm really pleased that we managed to bring almost the ridiculousness of the image that you described of the minister doing yoga at, was it Alexanderplatz? You know, that's quite a comical image for me to walk away with. We are out of time now, but I just want to really end with just trying to summarize some of what we've spoken about. Just a couple of statistics actually, which I pulled from your video, Sajan. Every 15 minutes, a crime is committed against a Dalit. 6 Dalit women are raped every day. 66,000 children living in slums die due to malnutrition every year in India. So really, to try and round off this conversation, I want to kind of the audience, to really think about these issues around identity, you know, your individual identity, complicity, and romanticism as well. Within the kind of framework of this pandemic, we are all questioning what is our role, what kind of power and privilege do we have in this society, whether we're artists or whether we're individuals that are just doing normal jobs. You know, what is it? What are our values, and how we how do we view the world, and what are the politics of listening? Sometimes is our activism enough if we're just listening, or can we do something more in our daily lives, you know, to have these conversations, to listen to people who really haven't been heard, or those voices that have been silenced. So I think that's really it. We haven't really got time for questions. So unless there's anything else that either of you would like to say, would you like to say anything towards the end, both of you? No, you're both okay. Okay. So I think there should be a bit of space on the Facebook forum. If you'd like to pose any questions, I'm sure both our artists, myself, would be happy to answer them. But thank you so much for both of you for your time on a Sunday. And I hope the audience has taken something away from these really wonderful conversations. And please do take a moment to view both of these works. They're really important pieces of work at this current time that give you an insight into, you know, again, these cultural kind of phenomenons of yoga and how yoga is being used, but also some of the really rich material that Sohrab has gathered for his film that gives you really an insight into the kind of undertones of violence that exist in this image that you're seeing of India, what's happening in the background. So thank you again, both of you, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kajal. And thanks, Sajan. It's so nice to meet you.
Thank you.